What if everything you knew about yourself was a lie? What if the life you're living right now was actually a carefully constructed illusion by someone else? In Iskender Pala's 0 Point, a man discovers that his entire existence has been manipulated, erased, and rewritten. But here's the twist. When he finally reaches a 0 Point, the moment where everything collapses, he doesn't find destruction. He finds a terrifying freedom of starting over. And that freedom, it might be the most dangerous thing of all. Stay with me, because what happens in this book will make you question every choice you've ever made and every identity you've ever claimed as your own. Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving deep into one of Turkish literature's most philosophically intense novels, İskender Pala's Cypher Noktası, or 0 Point. This isn't just a story. It's a psychological labyrinth that questions the very foundation of identity, existence, and reality itself. İskender Pala, known for his profound understanding of Ottoman culture and Sufi philosophy, crafts a narrative that sits at the intersection of Eastern mysticism and Western existentialism. 0 Point takes us on a journey where a man loses everything, his name, his past, his relationships, his very sense of self, and must confront what remains when all the layers of identity are stripped away. Before we begin, let me warn you, this novel doesn't offer easy answers. It asks uncomfortable questions about who we really are beneath all the roles we play, all the stories we tell ourselves, and all the identities we construct. So buckle up, because we're about to descend into the void. Our story begins with a protagonist whose name itself becomes fluid and uncertain throughout the narrative, a deliberate choice by Pala to emphasize the theme of identity dissolution. Let's call him the man for now, because even that basic designation becomes questionable as we progress. The man we meet at the beginning of the novel appears to have a normal life. He has a profession, relationships, daily routines, all the markers of a functioning existence in modern society. But something is wrong. There's a crack in the facade, a sense that everything is slightly off-kilter, like a painting hanging at an imperceptible angle that nonetheless creates a sense of unease. This discomfort intensifies when the man begins experiencing strange disconnections from his own life. He looks at photographs of himself and doesn't recognize the person staring back. He hears stories about his past that feel like they belong to someone else entirely. Conversations with people who claim to know him intimately feel like interactions with strangers discussing a fictional character. What Pala does brilliantly here is create a creeping sense of unreality. The man isn't suffering from a sudden, dramatic break with reality. Instead, his world is slowly, inexorably unraveling, thread by thread. It's like watching ice melt. You can't pinpoint the exact moment solid becomes liquid, but you know that a fundamental transformation is occurring. The man begins to investigate his own life as if he were a detective examining a crime scene. He goes through documents, revisits places from his supposed past, talks to people who claim intimate knowledge of his history. But each investigation only deepens the mystery. Facts don't align. Memories contradict each other. The more he searches for solid ground, the more quicksand he discovers beneath his feet. This is where Pala introduces one of the novel's central philosophical concepts, the idea that identity is not a fixed essence, but a narrative construction. We are, the novel suggests, stories we tell ourselves and that others tell about us. But what happens when those stories stop making sense? What happens when the narrative collapses? As the man's investigation intensifies, he discovers something shocking. There are deliberate gaps in his history. Records have been altered or destroyed. People who should remember him have no recollection of his existence. It's as if someone or something has been systematically erasing him from reality. This is where the concept of the 0 Point begins to take shape. In mathematics and physics, 0 is both nothing and the point from which everything begins. It's the absence that makes presence possible, the void that gives meaning to existence. Pala uses this concept metaphorically to explore what happens when a person is reduced to 0, when all accumulated identity, all social roles, all personal history is stripped away. The man realizes he's been the subject of an experiment or perhaps a cosmic joke. His life has been manipulated by forces he doesn't understand. Whether human conspirators, metaphysical powers, or the universe itself remains ambiguous throughout the novel. What matters is that he's been reduced to the 0 Point, a consciousness without a fixed identity, an awareness without a stable self. Initially, This revelation is terrifying. Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that your entire life, your name, your family, your job, your memories were all fabrications. You're not who you thought you were. Worse, you might not be anyone at all. This is existential horror at its purest. Not the fear of death, but the fear of never having truly existed in the first place. But Pala doesn't leave us wallowing in nihilistic despair. Instead, he suggests that reaching the 0 point might be a form of liberation. If all your identities are constructions, then you're free to construct new ones, or to exist without any fixed identity at all. Here's where Pala's deep knowledge of Sufi mysticism becomes central to understanding the novel. In Sufi tradition, there's a concept called fana, the annihilation of the ego, the dissolution of the self that separates the seeker from divine unity. The 0 point in Pala's novel functions as a secular or psychological version of fana. The Sufis teach that what we call the self is actually a veil that prevents us from experiencing reality directly. Our ego, with all its attachments, fears, desires, and stories, creates a barrier between our consciousness and truth. To reach enlightenment, this ego must die. The self must be reduced to nothing, so that everything can be experienced. The man in 0 point undergoes something similar, though his journey is presented in contemporary, psychological terms rather than explicitly religious ones. As his constructed identity crumbles, he experiences what might be called ego death, a complete dissolution of the familiar self-structure. This experience is paradoxical. It's simultaneously terrifying and liberating, empty and full of potential, death and rebirth. Pala describes it with prose that shifts between clinical detachment and lyrical intensity, mirroring the man's fluctuating mental state. In one powerful sequence, the man sits alone in an empty room, stripped of all possessions, all connections, all markers of identity. He has reached the 0 point, and in that moment of absolute emptiness, he experiences something unexpected, a kind of peace. When you have nothing left to lose, when you are nothing in particular, you're also free from the burdens of being something specific. But the novel doesn't end with a man floating in a blissful void of non-identity. Pala is too sophisticated a thinker to suggest that ego dissolution is a final destination. Instead, the 0 point becomes a starting point, a place from which the man can begin to consciously construct a new relationship with identity and existence. This is where 0 point becomes particularly relevant to contemporary discussions about identity. In our modern world, we're constantly bombarded with identity categories, social roles, and narrative frameworks that tell us who we should be. We're expected to have a coherent life story, a consistent personality, a stable sense of self that persists from birth to death. But what if that's impossible? What if the self is inherently fluid, multiple, and contradictory? Pala suggests that recognizing this fluidity, reaching the 0 point where we acknowledge that we're not any one fixed thing, might actually be healthier and more authentic than clinging to rigid self-concepts. The man begins experimenting with different identities, not as deception, but as exploration. He tries on various roles like one might try on clothes, seeing which ones fit comfortably and which ones chafe. He engages with people from different social worlds, adopting different personas in different contexts. He's not being fake. He's being honest about the multiplicity of the self. This section of the novel has strong echoes of both postmodern philosophy and ancient wisdom traditions. Thinkers like Foucault and Derrida deconstructed the notion of a stable, essential self, arguing that identity is always relational, contextual, and performed. But centuries earlier, Buddhist and Sufi mystics were making similar points through spiritual practice rather than academic theory. Pala bridges these traditions, showing how ancient mystical insights and contemporary philosophical ideas converge on the same truth. The self is not what we think it is. One of the most emotionally compelling aspects of 0 point is how it explores relationships when one person has undergone ego death. The man reconnects with people from his former life, a lover, a friend, a family member, but he's fundamentally changed. He's no longer the person they knew, and he can no longer relate to them in the old, familiar ways. This creates profound difficulties. How do you maintain intimacy with someone when you no longer have a stable self to offer? How do others love you when you're not consistently the same person from one day to the next? Pala doesn't shy away from these painful questions. In one particularly moving sequence, the man's former lover confronts him, demanding to know why he's changed, why he become a stranger. She wants the old version of him back, the version she fell in love with, the version that made sense within her own life narrative. But that version no longer exists. It might never have existed in the way she imagined. The man tries to explain the 0 point to her, tries to share his experience of ego dissolution and liberation, but his words sound like madness to her. She sees not enlightenment but breakdown, not freedom but loss. And from her perspective, she's right. He has lost something, the capacity to be a stable character in her story. This raises one of the novel's most profound questions. Is a 0 point a privileged state of consciousness that others should aspire to, or is it simply another way of being, with its own limitations and costs? Pala wisely doesn't answer definitively. Instead, he shows us the beauty and the tragedy of the man's transformation, letting us draw our own conclusions. Pala also explores how society responds to someone who has reached the 0 point. Social structures depend on people maintaining consistent identities. We need to know who we're dealing with, their name, their role, their history. Without these markers, social interaction becomes impossible. The man finds himself increasingly unable to function in conventional society. He can't hold down a job because he no longer identifies with any particular profession. He can't maintain long-term relationships because he's fundamentally unstable in his sense of self. He can't even complete bureaucratic procedures because he feels detached from the legal identity associated with his name and documents. This leads to a kind of social death that mirrors his ego death. He becomes invisible, marginalized, homeless in both the literal and metaphorical sense. Society has no place for people who won't or can't maintain stable identities. Pala uses this to critique the rigidity of social systems and the violence they do to human complexity. We force people into narrow identity categories: citizen, worker, consumer, family member, and punish those who don't fit neatly into these boxes. The 0 point reveals the arbitrariness of these categories, but also exposes how deeply they're embedded in the structure of human civilization. The man meets others who exist on the margins, homeless people, artists, mystics, the mentally ill, and recognizes in them fellow travelers who have, in various ways, fallen through the cracks of conventional identity. Some have reached their own 0 points. Others are simply broken by a system that couldn't accommodate their particular form of being. These encounters suggest that the 0 point isn't rare or exceptional. It's happening all around us, to people who can't maintain the fiction of a stable, socially acceptable self. Society just prefers not to see them. As the novel moves toward its conclusion, the question becomes, can a man return from the 0 point? Can he reconstruct a functional identity that allows him to exist in the world while retaining the insights gained from ego dissolution? Pala suggests that complete return is impossible. Once you've seen to the illusion of the fixed self, you can't unsee it. But adaptation is possible. The man learns to inhabit identities lightly, holding them loosely rather than clinging to them as absolute truths. He becomes like an actor who knows he's playing a role, but commits fully to performance anyway. This is reminiscent of the Zen concept of, after enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The idea that spiritual realization doesn't remove you from ordinary life, but changes your relationship to it. You still do the same things, but you do them with awareness of their constructed, provisional nature. The man finds a kind of employment, establishes new relationships, even rediscovers simple pleasures like eating, walking, observing the world. But he does these things without attachment, without the belief that they define who he is. He exists at the 0 point even while engaged in the fullness of life. This balance between emptiness and engagement, between dissolution and construction, represents Pala's ultimate vision. The 0 point isn't meant to be a permanent state of detachment, but a reference point that you can return to, a reminder that all identities are masks you were rather than who you fundamentally are. Let's step back and examine the broader philosophical implications of 0 point. Pala is engaging with some of the deepest questions in philosophy. What is a self? Does personal identity persist over time? What survives when everything you think you are is stripped away? Western philosophy, particularly since Descartes, has been obsessed with finding a foundation for the self, some irreducible core that persists despite all changes. Descartes claimed, "I think, therefore I am," pausing consciousness itself as its foundation. Later thinkers like Locke argue for memory and psychological continuity as the basis of personal identity. But 0 Point challenges these foundations. The man discovers that consciousness without content is merely an empty awareness, that memories can be false or manipulated, that psychological continuity is an illusion we maintain through narrative effort. When all these supposed foundations are examined closely, they dissolve like mist. This brings Pala closer to Buddhist philosophy, which teaches anatta or no self, the idea that there is no permanent, unchanging self to be found. What we call the self is actually a process, a constantly changing flow of experiences, thoughts, and sensations. We mistake this process for a thing, this verb for a noun. The 0 Point is the moment when this mistake becomes apparent. The man realizes he's not a thing that is experiences. He's experiencing itself, the process of being aware, which can't be reduced to any particular identity or fixed essence. Why does this 30,000 character discussion of 0 Point matter for contemporary readers? Because we're living in an age of identity crisis, both personal and collective. On a personal level, modern life fragments our sense of self. We present different versions of ourselves on social media, at work, with family, with friends. We curate our identities, constantly managing how we appear to others. This creates a kind of low-level identity anxiety, the sense that we're not being authentic, that we're frauds who might be exposed at any moment. 0 Point suggests that this anxiety arises from the mistaken belief that there's a true, authentic self beneath all these performances. But what if there isn't? What if all selves are performances? All identities are constructions. The 0 Point reveals this truth, and while initially disturbing, it can be liberating. You can't be inauthentic if there's no authentic self to betray. On a collective level, contemporary politics is increasingly organized around identity, race, gender, nationality, religion, and countless other categories. These identities provide meaning and community, but they also create rigid boundaries and conflict. People defend their identities as if their lives depend on it, because psychologically, they do. Our sense of self is deeply invested in these group identities. 0 Point asks what happens when we loosen our grip on these identities, when we recognize them as provisional and constructed rather than essential and eternal. This doesn't mean abandoning all categories or pretending differences don't matter, but it might mean holding our identities more lightly, recognizing that the boundaries between self and other are more permeable than we imagine. Before we conclude, let's appreciate Pala's literary technique in 0 Point. This is a straightforward narrative with a clear beginning, middle, and end. Instead, the structure mirrors the content. It's fragmented, circular, sometimes confusing, reflecting protagonist's disintegrating sense of self. Pala uses multiple narrative perspectives, shifts in tense, and unreliable narration to create a reading experience that's destabilizing. You're never quite sure what's real, what's memory, what's hallucination, what's metaphor. This isn't sloppy writing. It's deliberate technique designed to make you experience something like what the protagonist experiences. The language itself shifts throughout the novel. Early sections use conventional, realistic prose. As the man approaches a 0 Point, the language becomes more abstract, poetic, even mystical. In the depths of ego dissolution, words themselves seem to break down, approaching the limits of what language can express. This is appropriate because the 0 Point is, by definition, ineffable, beyond words. How do you describe the absence of self? How do you narrate the experience of being no one in particular? Pala pushes language to its limits, creating prose that gestures toward what cannot be directly said. So where does 0 Point leave us? Not with easy answers or comforting conclusions, but with a profound challenge to how we think about ourselves and our place in the world. Iskender Pala has given us a novel that functions on multiple levels. As a psychological thriller about identity dissolution, as a philosophical exploration of the nature of self, as a spiritual allegory about ego, death, and rebirth, and as a social critique of the rigid identity structures that constrain human possibility. The 0 Point, that moment of absolute emptiness when all constructed identities collapse, is presented not as a destination but as a passage. It's terrifying because it requires dying to everything you thought you were. But it's also liberating because it reveals that you were never limited to those narrow definitions in the first place. In our contemporary moment, when so many people feel trapped by identity, whether imposed by society or self-constructed, 0 Point offers a radical alternative. It suggests that the way out of identity's prison isn't to find your true self, but to recognize that the self was never what you thought it was. You're not a fixed thing, but a process, not a noun, but a verb, not a destination, but a journey. This doesn't mean anything goes, that all behaviors are equally valid, or that ethics and responsibility disappear. Rather, it means approaching life with what Buddhists call beginner's mind, fresh awareness unburdened by rigid preconceptions about who you must be. The man in 0 Point discovers that reaching zero, losing everything, can paradoxically be a gain. When you have no fixed identity to defend, you're free to respond to each moment authentically rather than according to a script. When you're not committed to being anyone in particular, you can be present to life as it actually is rather than as your identity demands it should be. This is Iskender Pala's gift to readers. Not a comforting story with heroes and villains and clear resolutions, but a mirror that reflects back the constructed nature of our own identities. Reading 0 Point is itself a kind of 0 Point experience. It destabilizes your assumptions, challenges your certainties, and invites you to question who you think you are. And maybe that's exactly what we need. Not more identities to claim, not stronger selves to build, but the courage to occasionally return to zero, to the point where everything dissolves and anything becomes possible. Because it's only from that emptiness that genuine newness can emerge. Now, before you go, I want you to think about something, and I really want you to sit with this question. If you woke up tomorrow and discovered that every identity you've claimed, your job, your relationships, your beliefs, even your name, was suddenly stripped away, what would remain? Who would you be at your own 0 Point? And more importantly, would you have the courage to find out? This isn't just a thought experiment. It's a question that might change how you live your life today, right now, in this very moment. If this exploration of identity, existence, and the nature of self resonated with you, if it challenged you, unsettled you, or opened up new ways of thinking, then I need you to do two things. First, hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into philosophical literature, existential questions, and books that don't just entertain, but transform the way you see reality. Every week, we explore works that challenge conventional thinking and push the boundaries of what literature can do. Don't miss out on these journeys into the depths of human consciousness. Second, leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever experienced your own 0 Point? A moment when everything you thought you knew about yourself collapsed? Or maybe share which philosophical novel you'd like us to explore next. Your engagement doesn't just help the algorithm. It creates a community of deep thinkers who aren't afraid to question everything. And if you found value in this exploration, share it with someone who needs to hear it. We all know someone who's stuck in rigid identity constructs, someone who might benefit from understanding that they're not as fixed as they think they are. Remember, you are not who you think you are. And that's not a problem, it's an invitation. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and don't be afraid to reach your own 0 Point. This has been another deep dive into transformative literature. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next exploration.